An arrogant coach humiliated his students for years. But that day, he chose the wrong target. Jason Statham walked in quietly and changed everything. What started as just another MMA lesson became the public downfall of a false leader in front of everyone. And what Jason did after the last blow, no one will ever forget. The smell of dried sweat and worn-out gloves mixed with the hollow sound of punching bags being hit with fury. The atmosphere inside Iron Discipline MMA gym was hot, dense, a heavy air made of screams, short breaths, and egos stretched to the edge. The raw concrete walls mirrored the spirit of the place, tough, relentless, impersonal. This was where you sweat, where you bled, but also where you were tested. Not just your strength, but your submission. At the center of that universe ruled Dean Riker, a man with a hoarse voice, puffed chest, and eyes that pierced through hesitation, a former lower league fight champion, once a promising name in MMA, once an almost star. Now, a frustrated and authoritarian trainer who found glory not in teaching, but in dominating. He trained youth with insults, corrected technique with shoves, defined respect by the volume of public humiliation. That morning, the gym pulsed as usual. Loud music, gloves pounding, shouted commands, eyes avoiding direct contact with Dean. Near the improvised octagon in the back, a skinny young man with an anxious face and a torn t-shirt tried to hold his guard while being pummeled by a stronger peer. His chin trembled, not just from pain, but from shame. And then the front door opened. No sound, no announcement, no rush. The man who entered was a presence, not an event. Light jacket, dark jeans, steady stride. No signs of urgency. His eyes scanned the room like someone who already knew that environment. Not that specific address, but that kind of space. Dirty, harsh, full of unspoken codes. It was Jason Statham. No one noticed him right away. It was too soon. And in that space, if you didn't shout, you weren't seen. Jason walked to the darkest corner of the gym. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't introduce himself. He just leaned against the wall, crossed his arms, and observed. As if he was waiting for something, and he was. In the middle of the room, Dean Riker halted the group training to call out, once again, the skinny, trembling boy. He told him to get up, to face the stronger opponent, to show guts. And when the boy hesitated for a second, the coach answered with what he knew best: humiliation. He shouted, walked in circles, called the boy dead weight, an embarrassment to the team, a cowardly rat. He spat sharp phrases and sharpened everyone else's eyes onto that single weakness. The boy lowered his eyes, and his feet, and his spirit. Jason remained still, his face relaxed, but his jaw was tight. Dean noticed the unfamiliar face leaning on the wall. His gaze narrowed. He knew that man, not personally, but he knew who he was. And knowing irritated him. He nodded at one of the assistants who whispered something in his ear. Dean smiled, a smile of contempt mixed with provocation. He didn't like having an audience for his display of power, especially a silent audience. Training continued for a few more minutes until Dean decided to walk across the gym toward the corner where Jason stood. Eyes began to follow him. It was rare for anyone to walk that way, even rarer to do so with that kind of walk, so loaded with intention. Jason didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the boy still kneeling, clutching his aching side and holding back tears. Dean stopped in front of him, and for a second, the silence felt heavier than the air. There was something about Jason that wasn't visible at first glance, but that took shape in discomfort. It wasn't his fame. It wasn't his stance. It was the way he carried the space, as if he had already been there before, as if he had already felt that fear, that humiliation, and had chosen to never let it happen in front of him again. Dean said something low, but laced with venom. Those closest heard it, and flinched. Jason simply shifted his gaze back to the fallen boy, a steady look like someone holding something far more powerful inside. The coach stepped away, returning to the center. He laughed alone, as if mocking the presence of someone he believed to be irrelevant. But deep down, he knew. Something was wrong with that tranquility. Something that threatened the order of dominance he had built in that place. Jason remained, quiet, watching, not as someone waiting for justice, but as someone ready to be justice itself. And then, it happened. The boy tried to stand and fell again. Dean didn't hesitate. He gestured to a stronger student and told him to show how it's done. The boy tried to back away. Dean shouted, told him to stop crying, told him to continue. And at that moment, the very second the stronger student prepared to strike the already bruised body on the floor, Jason moved. 2 steps. That's all it took for the entire gym to freeze. It wasn't the sound. It wasn't physical presence. It was the moment. The exact instant everyone realized that someone had broken the cycle, that a new force was in motion, one that didn't need to shout. Jason walked up to the injured boy. He knelt, placed a firm hand on his shoulder, as if saying without words that he was no longer alone. And he looked at Dean. A look without anger, without hurry, but loaded with something far more dangerous: conviction. Dean froze for half a second, just enough to lose control of the space. His students stared, all of them, for the first time, not to obey, but to understand. Jason stood up, never breaking eye contact with the coach, and returned to the corner, as if to say, "Now I've seen, and now you know." Dean laughed loudly, mocking the boy who lay crumpled on the mat. But when he turned back, he saw Jason standing closer, firmer, and the tension in the air was the kind that let everyone know something big was about to happen. The silence that followed Jason's intervention wasn't just an absence of sound. It was an emotional vacuum, a rupture in the abusive routine Dean had kept intact for years, a space where authority, once enforced by shouting, began to give way to a presence that didn't need to assert itself. Dean tried to regain control. He walked among the students, clapping his hands, shouting disjointed orders, forcing an enthusiasm that no longer stuck. But no one reacted with the same urgency. Most pretended to keep training. Others simply watched discreetly, the figure standing motionless in the corner of the gym. Jason, like a living statue. It was as if a new awareness had begun to rise in the air. A troubling idea. Maybe all of this wasn't normal. Maybe yelling wasn't teaching. Maybe humiliation didn't make champions. Dean, growing impatient, grabbed a loose punching bag and slammed it to the ground. His anger wasn't directed at the boy, nor the students. It was at the interruption, the invisible threat to his position, the presence of a man who, without saying a word, had made every gaze turn away from him. He approached the common area where lockers and benches were lined up. A few athletes stopped training, citing pain, fatigue, thirst. But everyone knew the real reason. They wanted to watch. Dean knew it too, and thrived on the stage. But today, something in the audience was different. Jason now moved through the gym. He passed between the students like a wolf among sheep, not to hunt, but to find who needed protection. His eyes scanned the details, how the students lowered their heads, how they stepped back when Dean came too close, how they hid bruises along their ribs. It was a silent language, but Jason spoke it fluently. He had lived it. Dean intercepted him, not with his hands, but with his tone. A sharp irony displayed in front of everyone. Jason stopped. He didn't respond, didn't look away. He simply held his gaze. An eternity fit inside seconds like those. The athletes glanced at each other. The tension became physical. It was as if the floor of the gym had tilted slightly, and everyone knew something, or someone, was about to fall. Dean walked away, laughing to himself like someone who believed they had won a battle the other never even fought. But the truth was different. The audience had already chosen, and he was no longer their leader. Later, during a technical session, Dean called all the athletes to the center of the mat. He ordered silence, said there would be a demonstration, and that Jason would participate. All eyes turned to the corner of the room where Jason stood. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. Dean mistook the silence for fear. And that was his greatest mistake. He picked the most experienced student in the gym, the fastest, the most explosive, someone who had trained for years under his tutelage, molded by the same aggressive and impatient style. A loyal soldier who obeyed without thinking. The instruction was clear. Prove Jason was just an actor. The student took his position in the center of the mat. Jason remained still. Time moved slowly. Sweat dripped from the walls, and no one dared blink. Then, finally, Jason moved. From the corner of the room to the center, his steps didn't change pace. He didn't look like he was walking into a fight. He looked like someone going because it was simply time to go. He calmly removed his jacket, revealing a plain shirt underneath. No theatrical gestures, no confrontational posture. But there was something in the way he placed one foot in front of the other that made every athlete there remember why they had started training in the first place. Dean crossed his arms, confident. He believed he had set the stage to expose the actor. He didn't realize he had lit the path to his own downfall. Jason stopped in front of the student in silence. The young man, trained to react quickly, made the first move, an aggressive lunge, almost a test. Jason didn't react, didn't retreat. He simply stood his ground, and that alone was enough to unsettle the fighter. The coach shouted from the corner, demanding action. Jason kept his gaze steady, not on the opponent's body, but in his eyes. He wasn't looking for physical weaknesses. He was looking for fear, and it was there. The boy launched a strike. Fast, precise, but empty. Jason dodged with his body, like smoke drifting away from the wind. The crowd murmured softly. Not at the dodge, but at how effortlessly it had happened. The student stepped back. Jason stepped forward. Not to intimidate, but to show he was there. And that he wasn't going anywhere. Dean, irritated, demanded the attack be repeated. And it was. But the result was even more humiliating. Jason didn't just dodge. He touched the student's arm gently, like someone teaching rather than punishing. That touch changed everything. The boy stepped back again, and this time, he didn't look to Dean for direction. He looked at Jason, not with defiance, but with respect. Dean shouted, cursed, called the student weak, a traitor, a disgrace. But no one else was listening, because something had broken. Something invisible, but impossible to repair. Jason walked away from the center of the mat with the same calm with which he had entered. And in that instant, everyone in the room understood that the hierarchy of the gym had been rewritten, not by the strongest, but by the most just. Jason's voice, though quiet, echoed throughout the gym. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. What Dean didn't know was that he had already lost control and the respect. The gym, once molded by the rigidity of sharp commands and automatic responses, now breathed differently. The sounds hadn't changed. Punching bags still swayed. Footsteps echoed across the mats. The clang of weights still rang out when dropped. But something new moved through the sweaty, worn walls. A focused silence. Not of fear, but of observation. The students began to notice details they had previously ignored. The way Dean corrected with anger, not with technique. The look that didn't offer guidance, only superiority. The absence of listening, the lack of care. Jason walked the gym's corners like someone inspecting not the equipment, but the invisible damage. Every suppressed expression, every shoulder that shrank when Dean passed, every bruise hidden beneath layers of athletic tape, revealed more than any shouted instruction. Dean, sensing the slow and dangerous erosion of his control, doubled down. He raised his voice. Called students by name just to humiliate. Invented challenges, extended training, created traps, all to prove he was still in charge. But something had shifted. The eyes no longer returned to him after each order. They sought another reference. a silent figure who had never asked for leadership, but had earned it. It was on a stifling afternoon, when the gym's ventilation failed and sweat ran down even the benches, that the breaking point became visible. Dean called all the students to the center. He said it was time to separate the real fighters from the celebrity followers. A direct attack on Jason's presence. He ordered beginners to face the advanced students. No protective gear. Let's see who survives reality. The mood hardened. The younger ones glanced around, some pretending to tie shoelaces, others rubbing already sore shoulders. No one wanted this, but no one dared speak up, until one of them stumbled after being shoved forward. He fell hard, the sound of his impact echoing louder than the background music. He didn't cry, but his watery eyes said more than 1,000 screams ever could. Jason was already in motion before anyone even noticed. He crossed the mat with steady but unhurried steps. He knelt beside the young man, checked his knee, calmly touched his shoulder, then looked directly at Dean. There was no anger, only a silent question in his eyes. How long will you let this go on? Dean exploded. He challenged Jason, said he had no right to interfere, that this wasn't his gym, that this wasn't a movie set. But Jason remained silent. A silence so solid it made Dean's shouting seem childish. And then, without warning, Jason did the unthinkable. He picked up the injured student in his arms and carried him to the side bench. With a simple gesture, he asked someone nearby for ice. The boy obeyed, not out of fear, but out of respect. Dean approached, seething with arrogance. He made exaggerated gestures, mocked, attempted to laugh, but no one laughed with him. The students had already chosen. Even the older ones, who had grown up hearing Dean's shouts as divine commands, now looked away. Some crossed their arms, others moved to the sidelines. The space around Dean was emptying, inch by inch. Jason, standing beside the injured young man, wasn't staring at the coach. He was reading the room. He knew. He knew that real change doesn't begin with a punch. It begins with emotional courage. With a simple act. Like caring for someone everyone else had learned to ignore. The boy, now seated with ice on his knee and eyes fixed on Jason, said nothing. But his breathing, once rapid from fear, now flowed calmly. He was learning something more valuable than a chokehold. He was learning that protection didn't have to come with screams, that leadership didn't require humiliation. Dean lost control. He grabbed a training glove, threw it to the floor, pointed at Jason, and delivered his ultimatum: fight or leave. Jason didn't move. He didn't need to. The noise on the mat no longer answered to Dean. His command was unraveling. Dean threw the gloves to the floor and stepped into the center. The silence fell like a curtain. He pointed at Jason and smiled with disdain. You want to fight, movie star? Let's see what you're made of. But what he didn't know was that the stage he had built wouldn't belong to him. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The echoes of Dean's footsteps across the mat reverberated like the drums of a war foretold. And yet, paradoxically, there was a strange calm in the air, as if everyone there, deep down in some corner of their soul, already knew how it would end. Jason took 2 steps forward, and the sound of his feet on the mat was louder than any shout that had come before. It was the kind of movement that didn't ask for attention. It commanded it. Dean pulled off his shirt, puffing out his chest as if trying to inflate his ego along with it. He attempted to show strength, but his eyes betrayed him. Something uneasy stirred beneath the surface. Jason wasn't watching his body, nor his theatrics. He was observing something else, the desperate need for validation. Around them, the students instinctively backed away, forming a circle. There was no rule for this, but everyone knew that space was now sacred, not because of the fight, but because of what it represented. Jason removed his jacket, folding it calmly before placing it beside the bench. No hurry, no posing. His body didn't flaunt exaggerated muscles, but rather a balance of strength and control. It was the physique of someone who learned to fight so they'd never have to prove anything again. Dean took his stance with raised fists, rotating his shoulders like a performer warming up for a show. But the audience didn't react, because this wasn't a performance anymore. It was a correction. Jason simply raised his arms in a neutral guard. Then, without warning, Dean lunged forward. The first punch came fast, aimed straight for the face. Jason twisted his torso subtly, and the blow missed by inches. The second, a left hook, missed too. Jason didn't counter. He observed. Every one of Dean's movements was predictable. Raw power without intelligence, urgency without purpose. Then came the spinning kick. Dean always loved using it to draw attention. A flashy, fast move, but one that left his body too exposed. Jason had seen it before hundreds of times, not just from Dean but from everyone who tried to impress with flair instead of intention. Jason rotated into the kick, caught Dean's leg midair, and with a simple hip twist, threw him to the floor. There was no cinematic crash, but there was a louder sound, the cracking of pride. Dean got up quickly, pushing off the ground in anger. His face burned, not from physical pain but from humiliation. Jason hadn't even thrown a single strike, and yet he had already won the first round, without brute force, just by showing what real control looked like. This time, Dean attacked with fury. Hooks, elbows, wild punches. Jason moved as if the world were in slow motion. He slipped, stepped back, spun. It was like watching water escape through grasping fingers. Then, when Dean lost balance for the briefest moment, Jason acted. A sharp elbow to the left rib, a short sidestep, and a clean shot to the solar plexus. Dean staggered. His body tensed. The air left his lungs. Jason stepped back. He didn't exploit the advantage. He wasn't there to destroy. He was there to reveal. Dean straightened up with difficulty. His eyes had changed. Less rage, more confusion. He was fighting someone who didn't fight with anger, and that was terrifying. He tried again, charged with his whole body. Jason ducked, pivoted, and threw Dean to the ground. The fall was rough, a dull thud that made some students instinctively take a step back. But Jason didn't follow him down, he didn't pin him. He just took 2 steps back and waited. Dean took longer to get up. He grabbed his shoulder, his wrist, spat blood. The gym was silent, and yet, everything was being said. The students' eyes no longer searched for orders. They just watched and learned what it meant to fight with purpose, to protect, not to dominate. Dean, in a final act of desperation, charged Jason with a guttural scream. A tackle. A desperate move from someone with no technique left, only instinct. Jason pivoted with his momentum and threw Dean to the ground with force. The entire gym felt the impact. For several seconds, no one moved. Jason stood, breathing in a controlled rhythm. Dean lay on the ground, staring at the ceiling, not from pain but from the collapse of everything he once believed to be power. Jason approached, knelt, and then extended his hand. It was the most powerful moment of the entire fight, not because of strength but because of the choice to lift someone instead of crushing them. Dean refused. He turned away, rose to his knees, spat to the side, stumbled to his feet. Jason returned to the corner, grabbed his jacket and put it on with the same calm as before. And in that moment, the gym wasn't looking at the winner of a fight. It was looking at the man who redefined what it meant to win. Dean fell for the 3rd time, breathless, humiliated. But Jason didn't finish him. He simply stood up, turned to the students, and did something no one expected. He reached out a hand to Dean. The silence was deafening. But what Dean would do next would reveal who he really was. Dean remained kneeling in the center of the mat, rivers of sweat running down his pale skin, muscles stiffened by shame. The silence in the gym wasn't one of respect, it was one of mourning. What was dying there wasn't a man, but an image. The image of a leader forged through shouting, sustained by fear, and fed by vanity. Jason stood tall, arms at his sides, observing. There was no provocation in his expression, no triumph, only clarity. The clarity of someone who had seen men like Dean before, many of them, and knew that the real downfall was never physical. It was internal, invisible, and irreversible. Dean got up with difficulty. His body moved by sheer instinct, but his soul hesitated. His gaze was lost, confused, without the spark of control that had once held his persona together. He walked in slow circles, fumbling for posture, trying to recover what he had lost with every blow he failed to land. And then, in a final act of desperation, he tried to attack again. Not with technique, not with calculation, but with pure rage. A reckless leap, a desperate swing, his body hurled like an avalanche toward Jason. But the one who fell wasn't Jason, it was Dean. Jason stepped aside, subtly, and gently redirected Dean's momentum with a touch on the shoulder, sending him crashing into the side cage. The impact wasn't just loud, it was symbolic. He had thrown himself into the very wall he had spent years using to trap others. Dean landed sitting, breathless, eyes wide. No one rushed to help him. For the first time, he was truly alone. The students looked at each other. None of them smiled. None of them cheered. It was as if they were witnessing a slow-motion shipwreck. Some looked away. Others crossed their arms. Respect had vanished. And without it, Dean was just another man on the floor. Jason, without even glancing at the fallen coach, walked back among the students. His gaze fell upon faces that once carried shame, and now carried reflection. The younger ones looked confused. The veterans, ashamed. Fear had lost its throne. Then Jason approached the injured boy from earlier, the one Dean had humiliated and forced to fight while injured. He was sitting now, watching everything in silence. Jason stopped in front of him, and without saying a word, knelt down. He extended his hand, not to lift him, but to acknowledge. The boy grabbed it without hesitation. That simple, uncelebrated gesture shattered what was left of the old order. Dean, still slouched against the cage, mumbled something to himself, trying to reclaim the narrative as if he could reverse reality by force. But the student's eyes no longer turned to him. It was too late, and then, as if the universe needed to close the scene with one last lesson, Dean staggered to his feet and crept up behind Jason. The few who still watched him felt a chill down their spine. For a second, the tension returned. Jason felt it. He turned slowly. Dean lunged with one last burst of effort, aiming for a cheap shot, a desperate grab, but there was no strength left, no direction. Jason moved with ease, sidestepped, and let Dean pass. The coach stumbled, hit his shoulder on the wall and fell, for the last time, to the gym floor. And it was there, in that clumsy, lonely, ridiculous fall, that the truth was revealed. He was no longer the center. Jason didn't retaliate, not even with words. He simply looked for a brief moment, then turned his back. He walked toward the locker room, where his jacket still hung. He put it on slowly as the sounds of the gym began to return one by one. Light footsteps, resumed breathing, quiet conversations. But none came from Dean. When Jason walked out the front door, he wasn't a hero. He was just a man who had returned humanity to a place that had forgotten how to breathe with dignity. Jason walked out through the front door without looking back. But the door to the gym remained open, and for the first time in years, no one ran to close it. The late afternoon light streamed through the windows at golden angles, reflecting off the ropes of the empty ring and the sweat-stained mirrors lining parts of the wall. The gym was still the same floor, the same weights, the same punching bags worn down by time. But the air, that had changed. There were no more shouts, no more fear. Where tension had once reigned, something new now filled the space. Active silence. A kind of peace that breathed along with the environment. A space where soft voices could be heard, and where movement no longer came from obedience, but from intention. Dean Riker didn't return. The morning after the fight, his office door remained closed. No one knocked, no one asked. He had left the place late at night without speaking to anyone, carrying a small duffel bag and the weight of a shattered pride. He was never seen there again. And curiously, no one asked about him. The group of athletes, on the other hand, remained. Some with hesitation, others with hope, all with eyes turned toward the future. The boy who had once been humiliated returned with his leg bandaged, but his head held high. His presence, once fragile and invisible, now radiated something new, unspoken confidence. In the days that followed, training continued, but in a different way. Students began helping each other. They corrected posture, exchanged tips, offered support. The absence of an authoritarian figure didn't weaken the group. It made them stronger. On Thursday, a new sign appeared at the entrance of the gym. There was no signature, just a simple phrase written in black ink on a white background. Respect is not imposed, it's cultivated. No one had to ask where it came from. Later that same afternoon, as the sun disappeared behind the buildings and the yellow light of the fixtures began to paint long shadows across the mat, Jason Statham returned. He entered the same way he had the first time. In silence, no music stopped, no heads turned dramatically, but everyone saw him. And they recognized him, not as the actor, the celebrity, the public figure, but as the man who, without saying a word, had changed the course of everything. Jason walked to the center where a small group was practicing basic movements. He didn't interrupt. He didn't lead. He simply watched for a few minutes, arms crossed, gaze steady. Then, he removed his jacket. He approached the boy who had fallen on the first day. He knelt beside him and with a light gesture adjusted the boy's hip position during a ground sequence. The boy nodded silently and kept going. Jason stood up. He looked around. There was no more resistance, only acceptance. For an hour, he moved around the room, correcting movements with gestures, demonstrating posture with his own body, picking up fallen bags, wiping sweat off the floor with towels, quietly, without ceremony. He was a coach without a title, a leader without a role, and still, everyone followed his steps with their eyes. The oldest student, a man with graying hair and calloused hands, approached and offered Jason a bottle of water. Jason accepted with a nod. The two sat in the corner of the gym, in silence. The man spoke little. He simply shared that it had been years since he had felt the desire to train with ease. Jason just listened, as if listening on its own was already a kind of answer. Not long after, he stood, hung the empty bottle, grabbed his jacket, and walked to the door. He paused for a moment, observing the scene. Students spread out, exchanging instructions with one another, quietly laughing, correcting their own mistakes without fear of being wrong. The ring was still there, the ropes worn, the floor marked. But something new had taken root. It was no longer just a fight gym. It was a space where everyone could grow, without needing to be crushed. And then, just as his hand touched the doorknob, a gentle voice emerged behind him. Not a literal voice, but a presence. The boy approached, still with his knee bandaged, and handed something into Jason's hands, a black training belt with his own name written in silver marker. Jason looked at it. He didn't say a word. He simply smiled, with the sincerity of someone who recognized the gesture for what it was. Gratitude without obligation. He handed the belt back carefully, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, as if to say, "This place is yours now." And then, he left. Outside, the air was cooler. The sky, painted in shades of blue and orange. The city pulsed at its usual rhythm, unaware of what had taken place inside that quiet building. But for those who had been there, nothing would ever be the same. Jason walked down the sidewalk in silence, passing distracted pedestrians, noisy cars, flickering lights. A teenager with a backpack saw him, paused for a second, unsure whether to say anything. Jason simply nodded and kept walking. When he turned the corner, vanishing into the motion of the city, One of the students still stood by the gym's window, watching. Not as a fan, not as a spectator, but as someone who had learned something unforgettable. Jason glanced at the new banner hanging on the wall. Discipline is more than shouting. It's knowing when to be silent. Then he took off his gloves, smiled subtly, and vanished into the muffled sounds of the punching bags. The gym was, at last, at peace. Jason didn't join that gym to fight. He joined to show that leadership doesn't shout, it inspires. And sometimes, the greatest strength is in silence. If this story touched you, like it now, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because the next stories will get you even deeper. And comment below. Have you ever seen someone fall from the top and without getting punched?